Good morning. Could you please turn with me to Matthew chapter 7? Matthew 7. As we said in class, sometimes I'm pretty transparent. If you know where we are in Matthew, you probably know there's a pretty good chance I was going to preach the Sermon on the Mount, which actually means we need to back up to chapter 5. So, chapter 5 of Matthew. And we need a title this week. Let's just call it All. Let's call it All. And in a lot of ways, the reason why all seems so appropriate is this, in a lot of ways, maybe it's because of the lens that I'm looking through right now, having talked in the latter part of the Psalms, of the way in which the Psalms corresponded to something that Jesus said toward the end of his ministry when he was asked what the greatest commandment was. He summed it up a little bit differently in each of the Gospels, but it really drew on something we've been emphasizing in the terms of loving the Lord your God with all your heart, your mind, and your strength. In some versions, he'll emphasize that's 3 of the 4 things he emphasized, the soul, of course, being the 4th. But in a lot of ways, when I looked at the Sermon on the Mount this week, it seemed to organize itself in a lot of ways along those same lines. In chapter 5, 6, and 7 really seem to each have a unique theme, and I'd always seen that in my past dealings with it, but this time, maybe because we've talked about it so much from the Psalms, it seems like he's really focusing on beyond the Beatitudes in Matthew chapter 5, what a proper perspective or a proper attitude is for a believer as he's setting out what many will call his Magna Carta of what his ministry is going to look like going forward. In chapter 6, a lot of what he's going to talk about is, okay, once you have your mind in the right place, I need you to reevaluate your motives on a number of issues. Why? So that when we get to chapter 7, the word do is going to have probably a more significant role than I've seen it in the past. Because in chapter 7, he's going to move from our mental state, beyond our motives, to how does it empower us to actually become effective at doing the things that God wants done. But let's begin in Matthew chapter 5. And we're going to, because 3 chapters is a lot to preach, we're going to talk about a few verses to start out with, and then we're going to keep moving to see how these themes seem to develop in these chapters. Chapter 5, beginning after Jesus has overcome the temptation in the wilderness. Verse 1 reads, "Seeing the crowds, he went up on the mountain, and when he sat down, his disciples came to him. And he opened his mouth and taught them, saying, Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted. Blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they shall be satisfied. Blessed are the merciful, for they shall receive mercy. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called sons of God. Blessed are those who are persecuted for righteousness' sake, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. And blessed are you when others revile you and persecute you and utter all kinds of evil against you falsely on my account. Rejoice and be glad, for your reward is great in heaven, for so they persecuted the prophets who were before you." And understand how those are all, they call them the Beatitudes, they are all talking about attitudes, right? And so they're not traditionally attitudes that we would associate with prosperity, but that term blessed means consider yourself fortunate when these things happen to you. And much like we saw in previous weeks when we looked at word studies through the lens of, okay, what does this actually look like? This week, that's for whatever reason, when I was going through logos, looking at the particular words in these blessings, there were characters that I saw over and over again that the other scholars were using to illustrate these principles. And just because we're trying to take a survey of the entire sermon, let's just look at a few of those. So when it was saying blessed are the poor in spirit, of course, in Luke's verse or Luke's version, sometimes called the Sermon on the Plain, we talked about it before, it simply says blessed are the poor. But ironically enough, one of the people they used to illustrate this principle was Daniel. And Daniel wasn't noticed for being especially impoverished. Why? Because he had ascended to heights even during the exile. And he was known for being one of the wisest men in the kingdom into which he had been taken into captivity. And one of the points at which Daniel's life seemed to illustrate this principle, at least to the scholars and logos, was the point at which all of the wise men were at risk of being killed because the king had seen through them. We've talked about it before. He was like, look, I'm tired of you interpreting things that I've told you I've dreamed. If you really understand that God is speaking to you, the things on my mind, tell me what I dreamed, and then interpret it. And Daniel, knowing that the interpretation of a dream only comes from God, once he had the interpretation that saved not only his life, but the lives of the wise men, he simply said, the interpretation of the dream doesn't originate with men, but it comes from God. And so when they were illustrating this principle of poor in spirit, what they were talking about is someone who fully embraces their emptiness on their own resources, their own wisdom, their own understanding to truly answer the deeper questions of life. And so as I went through other examples, it seemed to be that same thing. Even the poor who are put in a position to obviously understand they don't have physical resources to take care of their own needs aren't necessarily considered righteous because of that circumstance. It gives you the opportunity, much like if you were talking about a lot about this time of year is a time when the athletes and the students are coming back. You have the opportunity to make the most of this time in college by studying hard, appreciating as much as you can the downtime so that you can study hard when it's time to go back to class. But everybody gets an opportunity insofar as they've been accepted into our local schools, but not everybody, because we have a grading system that sorts out the C students from the B students from the A students. The opportunity is what you make of it. And poverty is one of those things that gives you the opportunity to develop strong character. But much like Daniel, if you miss the opportunity in poverty to realize it's more than simply your circumstance, but your spirit that needs to understand that it's not by my hand that I can feed myself, but it's only by God's Spirit that I can truly be guided into a growth that matters. And Daniel realized it wasn't by his wisdom, even though he had a reputation for being able to answer great mysteries by this time he was consulted. It's only by God that I got the interpretation of the dream. And so when God brought him into this period of prosperity, he gave a proper thanks, appealing to his own poverty of spirit. It's akin to humility, a term that we use a lot more commonly. When you look through some of the verses that came up in Logos, it looked like the whole question of being poor in spirit was a predicate or a foundation, like we talk about building a house. The foundation is in one of the more important parts that's easy to overlook. Why? Because once the structure goes up, it's like good refereeing. We talked about it before. If you see a good referee in a game, you're probably not paying attention to him because you're not angry, you're not yelling. The game just goes as planned, right? And that's what the foundation of the house is like. When that foundation is properly laid, you don't care because you don't see the cracks in the walls or the evidence of all the things that weren't properly laid in the foundation. Being poor in spirit is one of those predicates to humility. That's the foundation that sometimes we don't look to. But if it's not there, we can't have true humility. And without true humility, we can't have true growth. Talked about it before. A mentor, older preacher who had trained me in the ways or the things I could look forward to if I was blessed to be able to have any kind of longevity in ministry is all learning is predicated on humility. Why? Because you can't teach a man who already thinks he knows. And so being poor in spirit is a predicate for not only humility, but also growth. So as we move on, it says, blessed are those who mourn, for they shall be comforted. And this one didn't so much come from Logos, but it's always, for so many years, reminded me of that woman in Luke chapter 7 who entered the house of people who really looked down on her as she went straight to Jesus and washed his feet with her tears and wiped his feet with her hair. Understanding that when you really break it down and you understand for many women what it means to care for their hair, right? Come from a culture where hair means something. It's not something you just wake up and just kind of run out the house. And, folks invest a lot of time in caring for their hair. And so when this woman comes in not only to wash Jesus' feet, but she's doing it in the presence of, as the story goes, people who are like, if this man were really a prophet, he would know what kind of woman this is, and he wouldn't even let her touch him. And knowing their thoughts, he tells them a story that says basically, because she's been forgiven much, she couldn't care less what you think. And that's where her gratitude comes from. See, while you're still keeping up appearances, looking down on her for all the things that she's done, you don't realize that you need forgiveness just as much as she. But she's blessed because she's come to a place of mourning over where she was without the forgiveness, and a level of gratitude that says, no matter what this looks like, no matter what you think of me, and no matter what this audience says, I'm thankful. Because that place where I was mourning, just like it says here, blessed are those who mourn, for they shall be comforted. She was comforted, and she was unwilling to let appearances stand in the way of showing gratitude for the level of forgiveness that she found. And for whatever reason, that just always struck me as, blessed are those who mourn. Blessed are those who mourn. Blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth. It was odd. Of course, I've talked about it before. Moses was the meekest man of his day. And one of the things we've talked about is Moses having the strength to kill a man, apparently with his bare hands, and then go on to take the kind of ridicule that he habitually took from the children of Israel without lashing out, even though it finally got to him in the issue of striking the rock in the time when he was told to speak to the rock. But beyond Moses, there were some other odd examples that I didn't necessarily think of. They thought of Jeremiah when he delivered a prophecy that wasn't the kind of prophecy that folks wanted to hear. And in this particular juncture, they're debating whether or not to kill Jeremiah, kind of like a man would debate Coke or Pepsi. Jeremiah is like, whatever seems good to me, go ahead and do it. Because at this point, maybe I could call down fire from heaven, Elijah style or Elisha style. Maybe I could pray for deliverance from God, who's delivered me so many times out of so many other difficult circumstances. Maybe I could appeal to all those different things that the great prophets and priests and kings have appealed to over the years, but my life is in your hands, and I'm ad-libbing this because I'm tired. And so out of all the things that Jeremiah could have called down upon his enemies at that point, as they're debating whether or not he should live or die, my life is in your hands. It wasn't because Jeremiah was powerless. It was because he was meek, and we've described it before as power under control. It stands to reason that this man through whom God was talking had a prayer pipeline to God that would also potentially, if it wasn't his time to go, provide him defense against these people. But we see no evidence at this particular point of Jeremiah appealing for his life. He simply in meekness said, my job is done. If I live, I live. If I die, I die. It wasn't just Jeremiah. Stephen was another example that they brought up. Stephen, who was known by this time as a man who was mighty in the word of God. At Acts chapter 7 gives a long, seemingly off the top of his head, recitation of the history of Israel, not just for a history lesson, but that portion of Israel's history that showed the Pharisees of the first century that they were doing the exact same things, committing the exact same sins that their forefathers had committed against the prophets. This same Stephen, when he was stoned for what he had spoken, simply gave up the ghost and asked, similar to what Jesus did when he was on the cross, Father, please don't count this sin against them. He would, of course, have said, God, please don't count this sin against them. And so that's that sense of meekness. Stephen was specifically noted as a man who was mighty in the word, who didn't appeal to vengeance or God's vengeance, because he, as someone who knew Israel's history, also probably would have known God's history of vengeance. He could have appealed for the salvation of his own life. Seeing that Jeremiah had been delivered, he probably knew well the stories of Jeremiah and Isaiah and Ezekiel and the prophets who were delivered. But in that moment, just as Jeremiah had essentially given up his own life to the will of the people, Stephen seemed to do the same thing to a different end. And one of the few times one of my teachers noted that you will see after Jesus had ascended to the cross that he is actually standing at the right hand of God as opposed to seated at the right hand of God is when heaven receives Stephen's spirit. It literally describes Jesus as standing at the right hand of God to receive Stephen. And so it's a man who gave up his life in meekness, not appealing to the strength to which he could have appealed to. That's the picture of meekness that those other scholars saw in this particular beatitude. Moving on, blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they shall be satisfied. And this time Jephthah, for whatever reason, was a judge from the Bible who came to mind. Why? Because Jephthah, we've talked about him before. He not only had the tragic vow, but the tragic vow came about because God had given him a tremendous victory in battle. And Jephthah, being a young man who was driven out from his people because his mother was a prostitute, was sought out in their day of turmoil because they needed a man who could fight. But Jephthah wasn't just a man who could fight, because when he went out to battle, he knew the terms of engagement. And much like Stephen gave a strong defense illustrating why Israel was still stuck in the sins that had been condemned for hundreds of years earlier, he knew the history of Israel with the people he was going out to fight. So it wasn't just about the battle. Because even though he had become a mighty man, mighty enough for his brothers and his kinsmen to call him back to be a leader if he wins this battle, he's like, the battle, in many ways, as David would say, belongs to the Lord. And so he based that campaign on the fact that these invaders were making an illegitimate claim to Israel's territory. And he knew that. It was on his heart. And when he went out to seek terms of peace, he was able to intelligently recite the nature of the land dispute between Israel and its enemies, so that he could then go pray to God to defend Israel in righteousness and in justice, because they had a just cause. And so when you look at someone who hungers and thirsts for righteousness, we often talk about those times in life when we come to the crossroads where you don't have time to flip through the Bible to find out, okay, well, what? It has to already be in you. And so when we're seeing these people who are hungering and thirsting for righteousness, especially mighty men who could easily rely on the power of the sword. Why? Because the sword's been good to them. But they realize the sword isn't good enough. I need God. And it's hypocritical for me to apply or appeal to God and pray to him to defend an unjust cause. And so Jephthah, much like other righteous judges we've seen in the Bible, were people who had hungered and thirsted for righteousness, maybe in the same way that they hungered and thirsted for God to train their hands for war. Why? Because these were men who appealed to God in the day of trouble, not just their skills. Moving on. Verse 7, blessed are the merciful, for they shall receive mercy. Blessed are the merciful, for they shall receive mercy. Who does that remind us of? Who does that remind us of? Well, final judgment was the picture that came up this week during the study. Why? Because we talked about it before. It comes down to a simple division between sheep and goats at final judgment, where Jesus simply says, how did you respond to me when you didn't know it was me? You fed me when I was hungry. You clothed me when I had no clothing. Came to see me when I was in jail. Sheltered me when I wasn't sheltered. And because you showed, and it doesn't use this term, but this is obviously what these particular scholars saw as the connection between that beatitude and this parable or story of final judgment, is because you showed mercy, you're not going to be judged for your imperfections, but you are going to receive mercy. And so they correlated this particular beatitude to Jesus' own description of final judgment, where those who he receives are those who were actually merciful to him through the least of these. And moving on. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God. And this one was tough for me because for years, I've kind of wondered, what's the whole concept of pure in heart? Well, let's start with what it's not. It doesn't say pure in conduct. Whew. Right? A little bit of relief for me in the study this week, because it was blessed for the pure in conduct. Like, we're okay. Right? It's the beauty of humility and the standard and finding those tough scriptures, because there are, before long, we're going to see Jesus says, be perfect as your heavenly Father is perfect. He's going to say that before we get to the end of chapter 5. So it's still conduct that matters, but here he's saying the pure in heart. And why does that matter? And this isn't so much drawing on any particular story, but over and over again, that concept of purity in heart came up in our study of the Psalms. And in the context it came up in Logos this week, it was David in Psalm 18. After he had been given rest from all of his enemies, he simply offered up a psalm of thanks to God that you'll also see in 2 Samuel, if I'm not mistaken. It's either 1 or 2 Samuel. And he's simply saying, I have set all of your laws before me. And of course, he wasn't perfect under the law, but here's the thing that he did not do. He didn't simply set before him those portions or that portion of the law that he found it easy to adhere to. Oh, I love justice because Saul's not treating me very good right now, and I'd like fair treatment. So justice is really good, right? Or I like truth, right? Because it's easy for me to tell the truth right now. I really did kill Goliath, right? I'm kind of courageous. I'm experiencing a good period in life right now. But then that part about the leaving Uriah's wife alone, let's just, he set the entire law before him, whether it was easy in his nature to follow or not. And when he's talking about the pure in heart, he's not talking about the pure in conduct because David clearly fell. David was the type of man that when Nathan came and rebuked him for his failure under the law, it wasn't pulling teeth. It was, I've sinned under the law. I haven't relaxed the law even though I'm not great at keeping it. And so the pure in heart as opposed to the pure in conduct are the people who would look honestly, as we talked about before, that concept of righteousness is looking at the standard, not wincing from it, but acknowledging my failure under it, as opposed to me taking that mix of God's laws that affirm me and mixing them with those portions of the culture standards that help me feel free, and then coming out with this new thing that's Christ-like. Even though Christ-likeness is supposed to be a goal, it's not a goal that we're supposed to seek insofar as we are mixing or adulterating his standards. It's a goal that we're supposed to seek insofar as we're looking at what he's actually told us to do, being humbled by the fact that it is a difficult standard, and acknowledging one of the reasons why we so badly need a Holy Spirit is we need something more powerful than ourselves to truly live up to the standard as it's written. The pure in heart says, I'm not going to pretend the standard is different just so I can either look more righteous under the standard or just have an easier way to go. Because as we saw in the Psalms, once we got past David and saw the sons of Korah or Asaph or Moses or others, those righteous people knew that the standard wasn't going to change. And so they thanked God for that level of suffering they endured that kept them away from the day of judgment. And so we ask that question, can you have joy even in periods of suffering? If you understand that the suffering God wants for his people is the kind of suffering that keeps them from long-lasting pain and shame of consequences that we could otherwise avoid if we simply embrace the suffering in the short term. They also referred to Paul, as Paul wrote in his second letter to the Corinthians. I was glad that I grieved you, not just so you'd feel bad, but because your grief actually produced a change. We've heard it more traditionally, godly grief produces repentance. And so that's what he's looking at here in the pure in heart. He's looking at people who, even if they were grieved to mourning, the mourning produced future joy. Because one of the theme verses, I guess, I've kind of bounced off of folks for using is, he's going to wipe away every tear. There's going to be no more pain, no more mourning, no more crying. But the condition of that is allowing him to work in us a salvation that sometimes hurts, so that we can not only appreciate a place where there's no more crying or pain or mourning, but we can be people who are actually contributing to the peace in a place of perfection. And so when he's talking about blessed are the pure in heart, he's talking about the kinds of hearts that he can work with to mold into a place or into a fit with a place of perfect peace, which leads into the next beatitude. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called sons of God. And we'll just talk about that one as a derivative of the pure in heart. We've talked about it before when Brother Don sometimes offers the encouragement to the young kids to be good or be an example in school. We're talking about being, as God's children, the kind of people who provide kind of an oasis in maybe a spiritual, ethical, or moral desert that we go out to. Why? Because we live in a time when everybody has the freedom to do whatever they want, but not everything that, as Paul said, I am at liberty to do is beneficial. And so what he's talking about are people who improve the level of discourse in their environment because they choose what is beneficial as opposed to simply doing what they're free to do, even under Christ's law. because there were some freedoms that Paul had that he simply gave up. Why? To preserve the peace. He said Jesus came not to be served, but to serve, right? And we hear about the prophecies about him in Isaiah, and also as we read through the Psalms, one of the things he values is peace. And in order to preserve the peace, all the rights that he could have enjoyed as a true king on this earth, many of them we don't see him flexing in order to attempt to bring peace to first century Israel. But as we know, the story goes, he was willing to sacrifice so much that the price of peace was actually being killed by the very people he came to preach peace to. The beauty of the story, though, as our brothers talked about during the communion talk, is he left a legacy. And so the value of his story is the fact that he left people behind who, even though they didn't fully understand what he was doing while he was here in the body, once he poured out his spirit on his followers, they eventually got it. That just as he sacrificed, we now lead lives of sacrifice too. And so just as he left 12 apostles who started churches and counseled them, they left us these stories so that we can follow in the same vein. So that's so much of what Jesus is talking about, as now we really do just have to kind of move forward. After we get past the Beatitudes, and the next ones are basically going to some things we talked about early on the Psalms. Blessed are those who are persecuted, and skipping down to verse 11. Blessed are you when others revile, persecute, and utter all kinds of evil against you. It's adjusting our expectations so that, as Peter says, much of 1 Peter is devoted to, okay, if you served a Christ who was treated unjustly, wrap your minds around the concept that once you embrace these concepts, they're going to be so strange for the environments that you're going into that it's going to be almost like when something goes down the wrong way, your gag response is tripped, right? Unfortunately, to some people, your presence is going to be refreshing. But to others, you're going to trip their gag response because they aren't really trying to live this way. It completely defies conventional wisdom of what my freedoms entitle me to do. And so much like he said in John's gospel, right? Light came into the world, but the world hated it because it preferred the darkness. Why? Because those who are doing things that are wicked prefer to carry out those acts in the dark. And so light trips kind of a gag response for darkness. So expect the same kind of treatment that he got when he brought light into a certain situation. And so when you trip the gag response, when through no fault of your own, we talked about that difference between sin and reproach. Reproach being that level of abuse or shame that you endure, not for sin, but simply for being you. Sometimes it's a situation you were born into. Sometimes it's a situation that we talked about, Brian and I in private, talked about culture shock and how I was thinking of using that as a possible illustration. Sometimes it's just because you come from a culture that's different, no more or less sinful than the culture you're in, but it's just different to the people that you're around. And sometimes that just trips their gag response. And it brings you reproach, not because you've sinned, but because it just takes a while for you all to get used to one another doing stuff different ways. So that's what reproach is. It's not so much attached to a sense of sin as it's attached to a sense of difference. But understand how much worse it is when you are trying to bring a proper integrity into a world or an environment or a situation that is completely not conditioned to having to deal with the constraints of the whole truth, right? Or complete honesty. There's certain times when you're going to be forced into a situation where diplomacy isn't going to so much help you out. Because the Bible we talked about in the Proverbs, we don't have to necessarily give people a full piece of our mind. Speaking the truth in love is something that Paul called us to do, which points back to the proverb writers who said, look, understand how to say certain things, and you can avoid a whole lot of unnecessary trouble. But see, even Jesus, when we talked about Psalm 45, he had a mouth that was gifted with grace. He knew exactly how to get it said. But there was a point at which he simply had to say it, and there was no spin on it that was going to help dull the backlash that he was going to get. Sister Laura mentioned a quote. We were talking about this after church one day. Sometimes silence is golden. Sometimes it's just yellow. And that yellow being a metaphor for it's cowardice sometimes, right? And so the difficulty in life is sorting out, well, when is it appropriate? And when is it me just using an excuse to fit in? And so this is saying that you have to prepare yourself for those times when you do actually have the courage to step in, when there's no nice way to say it, Stephen. And the only response is going to be, as much as God has gifted you with a sense of his righteousness and a talent for how to say it, there's going to be no spin that's going to preserve the consequences that come with just telling the truth. And so when he's finishing up the Beatitudes, after he said, adjust your perspective to these attitudes, he's also saying, adjust your perspective to the backlash that is inevitably going to follow. Why? Because a servant is not above his master. And in a very few chapters later, he's going to start talking about the fact that, look, if they've called the master of the house Beelzebub, what do you think they're going to call you? Right? And so ultimately, if they've treated him this way, part of having the right attitude is understanding that you can't always avoid friction, and you can expect the same responses, or at least the same types of responses he got for simply doing the right thing. All right, we got to speed through the rest of this. Let's just go through the lay of the land on what the rest of the Beatitudes are, right? They're basically in the rest of chapter 5. He's going to talk about, now that these are the attitudes that you need to have, understand who you are. You are salt and light. And we're not going to go into detail. You probably heard some sermons on salt and light before, and even if I did really have it in mind now, I haven't left myself really the time to preach it. So refer to the examples that you've heard before on what salt and light is, and we can talk about it in more detail later, but we're really just doing a survey now. But after he says, you are salt and light, understand who I am, he's saying. He's saying, I have not come to abolish the law, but to fulfill it, right? And so at this point, he's telling them that all those things you've heard from the law, this is not license to simply live lawlessly and disregard it. No, he came as a fulfillment of those principles, allowing us to understand what those written codes actually look like in a person who's actually following them perfectly. Because that was one of the things. Even though Paul described himself as blameless under the law, there was obviously still a void or something that was missing in his heart, because he was applying the law or interpreting it as an excuse to go kill other believers, right? And there's something going wrong if you consider yourself blameless under the law, but you're murdering under it. Why? Because one of the very first things he's going to talk about after being the fulfillment of the law is anger. You have heard, and it's going to set up a pattern through roughly 6 principles that he's going to talk about. Starting in verse 21, you have heard that it was said, those of old, you shall not murder. Verse 22, but I say to you. Down when he's talking about lust in verses 27 through 30. You have heard in verse 27. Verse 28, but I say to you. Divorce in verse 31. It was also said in verse 32, but I say to you. Talking about oaths in verse 33. Again you have heard in verse 34, but I say to you. Retaliation. You have heard in verse 38. Verse 39, but I say to you. And finally, as he's ending up what we have now is chapter 5. In verse 43, you have heard, verse 44, but I say to you. It's a simple set of contrasts over and over again that he's using to, if you see the topics that he's talking about, they're basically a reevaluation of the second half of the 10 Commandments. Why? First 5 of the 10 Commandments had a lot to do with our relationship with God. Why? No other gods, right? No images of God. Don't take the name of the Lord in vain, right? Remember the Sabbath to keep it holy. And one that seems like it relates to people when he's talking about honor father and mother. But if you look at it from one point of view, mother and father are your first introduction to authority structures on this earth as a child. And so in a lot of ways, they fit into that God portion of the law. When you shift to the second portion, it really is talking about your relationship with people, whether or not they're in any kind of position of authority at all. Why? Don't murder. Don't commit adultery. Don't steal. It's 4 fingers. So don't lie. And don't covet. Right? And so these are the things that he's really reevaluating here. We talked about it before. Why? Because when he says in verse 21, you have heard it said of old, you shall not murder, and whoever murders will be liable to judgment. But I say to you that everyone who is angry with his brother will be liable to judgment. He goes on from there about the things that we can say in anger that will make us in danger of hellfire. And so he's saying it's not good enough, as we talked about before, to stop your temptation at the point that you want to kill. You got to stop it at the point you're angry. Why? He wants us to stop it so much that even if we're going to church with our gift, I don't want your gift until you make peace with your brothers, because that's how serious this is. It's not just about killing. It's about the resentment that builds up. The Hebrew writer says, do not let it, we talked about it before, any root of bitterness spring up. Why? Because it's going to defile you? No, because it defiles many, he says. And that is what Jesus is saying. We're elevating the standard that you were used to under the law. I'm fulfilling it by showing you how much more serious it is to avoid the path that leads to killing. Same thing with lust. You have heard, verse 27, it was said, you shall not commit adultery. But I say to you that everyone who looks at a woman with lustful intent has already committed adultery with her in his heart. This is a place where I have to stop and simply say thank you. Because to the degree that the ladies and the sisters in this congregation take it upon themselves to try to help those of us who are men or even just single brothers by simply trying to dress what was become a four-letter word, modesty, I guarantee you we appreciate it. Why? Because this is difficult. He's talking about the degree to which this affects our souls. And as men, when you see women who are trying to help you, I can't tell you how much that means, right? Because just like David, it's not just the things I think I'm good at. I'm going to be judged the things I'm not so good at. And so I appreciate people whose gag response isn't tripped by the thought of modesty. Right? But they realize that it's a relationship. I have a responsibility to try to look on you with honor, and I appreciate the degree to which you don't make my cross any heavier than it has to be. So in that relationship, sometimes it's important to simply pause and say thank you, because this is a difficult part for us. Because he's saying, look, it's not just at the point where you commit adultery. He's saying it's the point at which you look with lustful intent. And sometimes it can be so easy, fellas, to twist that portion that says with lustful intent and say, okay, I looked, but I didn't have lustful intent. No, here's the problem. It's a relationship. And one of the added burdens that I have to acknowledge the culture places on us is when we're in environments where modesty is not the standard. It's almost kind of like it's a major look culture. Major look! But I also appreciate, sisters, I heard one sister talk about, I can't use the term that she said, but she's like, when I was young, I used to set it out. Meaning, I used to use, right? When I was looking, I would set out what I knew God had empowered me with to make men look, right? And so I had to be honest with myself at a certain point and realize that I had a choice to make in terms of how I was going to carry myself, right? And so ultimately, we as men, we have to make sure that we don't use that clause that says looking with lustful intent as an excuse to just look. Because that's my temptation. It's to make excuses, right? When I'm in a situation where it's tough, it's calling on me to go the extra mile to avoid, it's my temptation to water down that principle of the law. And not only being pure in the way that I look at a woman, but being pure in the way that I'm starting to play games with what God has really called me to do. And so that's part of our battle. It's not only the avoiding the temptation to look, it's playing around with where I'm actually starting to get into sin, right? And so it's multi-layered. And so he's saying, once again, you've heard it's just adultery, but I'm telling you the battle starts before that. And so thanks to those who consider others when they're deciding how they're going to go about either looking at a sister or sisters who are taking it seriously, how their beauty affects the men around them. Thank you, sisters. Divorce. He talks about divorce. It was also said in verse 31, whoever divorces his wife, let him give her a certificate of divorce. But I say to you that everyone who divorces his wife except on the ground of sexual immorality, and some translations simply say unchastity, which is even a more narrow window of interpretation, makes her commit adultery. And whoever marries a divorced woman commits adultery. You know I'm not getting into that today. I'm not going there. But I will say, once again, he's raising the standard, right? It's not just divorce, right? And so if we're talking about those 10 commandments, well, we've already talked about adultery. Marcus, which part one talks about divorce? No, well, you no longer your own. The two shall, man shall leave mother and father and be cleaved to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh, right? You now have a proprietary interest in that relationship. And so breaking it is akin to theft. It's akin to stealing. It's akin to tampering with her interest in you and your interest in her. And so it, once again, elevates the standard. If God was that upset about the thought of stealing stuff, how much more upset is he about the path that leads to tampering with our most sacred of
relationships. Oaths, again you have heard, verse 33. It was said to those of old, you shall not swear falsely, but you shall perform to the Lord what you have sworn. But I say to you, do not take an oath at all, either by heaven, for it is the throne of God, or by earth, for it is his footstool, or by Jerusalem, for it is the city of the great king. And do not take an oath by your head, for you cannot make one hair white or black. Let what you say be simply yes or no. Anything more simply comes from evil. And the best treatment of this I think I've ever heard was, once again, from the ministers of the Bible Project. When he was talking about, in common language, what he's talking about is spin. My temptation when I enter into a deal, I was watching a movie about a guy who was losing his job at a major investment firm. And in order to transition into another job and not have to have that explanation for that gap in his resume, he spun some numbers on a deal that otherwise wouldn't have gone through. And that's what he's talking about here. He's talking about, as individuals, whether we're cooking the books or simply engaging with other people on a daily basis. We talked about in Matthew chapter 1, how Jesus did not take pains to hide the less appealing parts of his family tree. So while everybody is tempted to brag about, oh yeah, I got a king in my lineage. No, I'm related to a duke. Oh, it's George Washington. Yeah, no. He's like, you know what? We got incest right here, and then this guy slept with his daughter-in-law, and then this whole people were, right? And it's right there in Matthew chapter 1. He's not hiding it. What he's talking about here in chapter 5 is avoid the temptation to puff, to only emphasize those kinds of things that make you seem more appealing to the people around you, whether it's a financial transaction or just a human interaction. Let your yes be yes and your no be no. Everything else comes from a need to inflate and puff. How big the fish really was once I got off the lake. Right? Call them fish stories. We've talked about them before. But going on, those first two classes of things we've looked at, you can think about them in terms of Jesus helping us understand how the law relates really to difficult problems in murder or anger and lust. Difficult promises, when we talk about the commitment that we make to one another in marriage or in just taking oaths in general. But now we're getting into a part where he's talking about dealing with difficult people. Why? Because he's going to talk about retaliation. First and foremost in 38. We're not going to read that one, but he's talking about instances in verses 38 through 42, where people might do things that are absolutely wrong, that might justify us in wanting to take revenge. But he's saying there's another way that you need to go, right? Personal time of study, familiar passages. If a soldier asks you to go 1 mile, go 2, right? Sometimes it's counterintuitive. Instead of resisting the bully, let them see what it looks like for you to still stand up for yourself, but not fight, right? To try to help them out. If you understand that the underlying need for a person who's sometimes gotten used to intimidating is that's their way of asking for help. See beyond the indignity that they're offering you to possibly find ways that you can create peace by getting at the core issue that's motivating their bad behavior. That's in a lot of ways what he's asking us to do. He's asking us to see more deeply than our wounds and our offense. Oh, and it's so easy to preach. Let me drive out of here and have somebody cut me off on that street. Right? And I'm back to... Exactly. Right on time. Right, so, yeah. So these are real needs. Don't water down the standard, Marcus. Now you got them preaching it. Yeah, you got a whole week to go. And so that's what we're looking at. But he's saying, try to think beyond the indignity, the ways in which you can actually produce peace by being counterintuitive to those who try to intimidate you. But then he's like, but beyond people who you have passing encounters with who just do things that are either rude or just ungracious, you're going to be in relationship with people where sometimes it's going to seem like the nature of the relationship has been characterized by someone trying to put stumbling blocks in your way. How do you deal with a person who now seems like they're an actual enemy? Because the pattern of the relationship has fallen into negativity or hostility. And he's saying, love your enemies. Why? Because even the pagans hate their enemies and seek revenge against them and retaliate and do all those things that have gotten you into the condition that required Christ to leave heaven in the first place. The way out is having, once again, a different perspective on what an enemy is and how you have to treat them. And for whatever reason, this week I was watching gang stories because that's what I do, right? And the beautiful thing about what's happened in Los Angeles with some of the gangs is now, because of money, some of those gangs that were once killing each other on the sidewalks are now in business relationships with one another. And it's not perfect, but these were civil wars, right? That when I was growing up, it never seemed like they were going to be able to end. Matter of fact, they were franchising these conflicts and sending them out to other cities. We felt left out because we didn't have gangs in Houston. But like, why don't we have gangs too? Really? Right? But it becomes popular. And even though it makes no sense at all, sometimes you just feel left like we're not as tough because we don't have Bloods and Crips. Whatever. But now they're finding ways to get over it because some of the older members who now are looking for a different phase in life, something more than retaliation, and realize that at some point somebody has to stop shooting and find a deeper motivation for engagement. And that was the basis by which some of the more popular rappers, unfortunately, still had culture. One of them got shot. His name is Nipsey Hussle. He became famous for creating peace in a community that was known for open conflict. And here's the irony. He wasn't shot by someone who was notoriously or known for being his enemy. He was shot by someone who was close to him. Because life. And so this man who had risen above conflict to create opportunities for both people on two sides of an open, hostile conflict was killed by one of his own. Haven't heard any stories similar to that lately, have you? Right? Because by the time we get to the end of the Bible, it's Judas who is providing an open door into Jesus, right? And so these stories are here for us because they play themselves out over and over again. He came to suffer not simply so we could have stories to tell, but that we could look to his life as a guide of how we can negotiate these difficult times. And so let's just move on. Chapter 6, we said he's asking us to reevaluate our motives. Why? Because in verses 1 through 4, he's like, beware of practicing your righteousness, as John said in class today, before other people in order to be seen by them. And that's going to carry forward into 3 situations. 1, giving to the needy. Don't sound a trumpet when you're giving so you can be like, look at what I'm doing. Because he said you've already gotten your reward just by that simple pat on the back. It means so much sometimes, but it's so passing. Why? Because likes are fleeting. I don't remember the likes I got on posts like a year ago. Oh, but in that moment, is this going to go over well or is this? Yeah, but it fades. It's like, why would you trade what God is going to give you for a few likes on a post? And it seems irrational till you post something you really care about. And that's when it makes us all kind of realize, well, it's a danger. And so I look at the Pharisees, but then I look at me. And I realize I got a different temptation that leads me down the same path if I'm not careful. So he says, check your motives, Marcus. Don't do your giving so you can be seen by people. And when you pray, right? When is the next time I'm scheduled to pray? What am I going to talk about? Can I get all the prayer requests? Then I can add a little twist. Let's quote a few extra scriptures here, and then do a lot of here, and then show everybody what I studied this week here. And then by the time we're done, the prayer's as long as a sermon. Yeah. It's like if there's actually some value in that, Marcus, beyond you simply getting a pat on the back for sounding all extra preachy through your prayer, then it's okay. But if you're simply trying to get a pat on the back for articulating a great prayer, check your motives. Fasting. It's one of those things that he doesn't say when you fast. He said, I'm sure you've heard that talk before, right? It assumes that we're doing it. They'll be like, oh gosh, guys, oh really? Are you guys doing okay today? I'm not doing so well. I haven't eaten in a year. Right? Check your motives. Why? Because there are times when your good deeds are going to be so obvious that they're going to attract attention. But the person they should glorify is God, not me. Why? Because my motives shift and they change. And one of the ways God is described is faithful. Meaning he doesn't shift according to the crowd. You put me in some crowds and I'm just like, tempted to act like I don't like you could be my best friend, right? In one crowd, and then we go somewhere else, I'd be like, I don't know him. God's not like that. God is confident in every environment. And so when we're bringing glory to him, we're bringing glory to somebody who has they have their, for lack of a better term, they've got their priorities in check and their head screwed on straight. He's confident enough that he doesn't need my praise or anyone's praise.
And so he's stable. He fellowships me on the basis of whether or not I'm headed in the right direction, not whether or not I'm bringing glory to him through the applause that he'll get from people who, think it's cool that they know me. God doesn't need to name drop. Why? Because he is the highest name to appeal to. And so when he's saying these things about not looking or attention seeking, the reason why it's okay to appeal to God's name is because he's not a glory hound, right? He's not subject to all these different winds of friendship and things that can cause us to kind of, sometimes, I hate to say it, I've turned my back on friends that have been really loyal to me at times just because they weren't popular in the circle I was in. Man, it's embarrassing to say, but it's true. And so when we see God, we see an example of somebody who can help us live above that standard. But as Brian was talking about as well, one of the reasons why I say over and over again, I like the Bible insofar as it makes my job easy when it completely aligns with secular science or secular culture, is chapter 6 in a lot of ways is a case study in what we call the difference between personality disorders and mood disorders. Personality disorders in psych science are those where sometimes you look for too much out of your relationships. What can people give to me? It's kind of a more exploitative mindset. Anxiety disorders or mood disorders are ones who place too much responsibility on ourselves for whether or not our relationships are working out. So my tendency is whenever things are going foul, I'm always tempted to blame myself even when it's not really my fault because I've been conditioned to do that. And so that's what this chapter is. One, he's already gotten through talking about the temptation to be a glory hound, to look at people for whether or not they can praise me or whether or not they recognize how cool I am or how good I look or how righteous I seem. Right? And now he's talking about the temptation to go too far the other way into anxieties. And it's the anxieties that are brought about by, okay, what's my bank account looking like? Because if my bank account isn't looking right, then, there might be a certain image that I had back when I was in my prior preaching job, that there's an expectation that, wow, you got that job, you should have this amount of money in the bank. And so if my anxiety isn't so much I'm worried about, my daily bread. That's not an issue. But I am worried about what everybody else thinks about me because I should have a certain car or a certain house or a certain lifestyle that's consistent with the degree that I have. That's a level of anxiety that he's talking about is going to cause you a lot of trouble. Why? Because God's going to ask you to do some things that may not be consistent with the acceptance of your circle. And if you're fixated on what your circle thinks, you're going to be reluctant to go in directions that God has directed you to go. If I was fixated on that house I wanted for so long, it'd have been hard to let it go and go to the mission field, right? And so it's not setting up as an example, as I've talked before, about all the different things after I took an account of what I had done when I thought, I've given up everything for Jesus. And I was like, as I type on this laptop made by Apple, and these nice suitcases. And right, I still hadn't given up everything. But there were certain things that God, through baby steps, had allowed me to learn to let go of so that I could fully hear or see the doors that he was opening up in the way of opportunities to serve him. So when he's saying, don't be anxious about or laying up treasures in heaven, understand the degree to which our priorities, our financial priorities here, can blind us to opportunities that God is opening for us to actually follow him more closely. Don't be anxious in verse 25 about your life, what you will eat or what you will drink. And that's more or less along the lines of, okay, now if you are in a circumstance where you're not necessarily sure where your shelter is going to come from, your next meal is going to come from, he's got that too. I don't have time to go into it, but that's one of those things where you don't want to let anxiety overwhelm you. And as Brian has already pointed out in verse 34 of chapter 6, therefore do not be anxious about tomorrow, for tomorrow will be anxious for itself. Even when you got the money and the stuff in order, you still, part of being in those jobs that make good money is having a lot of stress that cannot be taken care of in an 8-hour workday. So more of your future can get consumed in anxiety when you're actually not having to worry so much about money, because that's the trade-off. Nobody's giving the money away, right? It comes at a cost, by the sweat of our brow, right? And so even if all these other things aren't causing you anxiety, even if you're not, tempted to seek undue praise, sometimes just realize the ways in which God, if he gave us the job and we're meant to stay in it, anxiety isn't helping us shoot any straighter.
right? It's not helping us perform any better under pressure. And so God is saying, one of the faith can sound like this flowery, when sometimes we talk about the poetic language. Sometimes faith is just functional. Because in order to calm down and function under pressure, I simply have to be able to trust that it is going to work out when God has said it is going to work out. And in circumstances under which he said it's going to work out. So that my part, the part that has to do with mind and heart, can function at top level, for lack of a better term, so I can do my part to the fullest of my ability. That's why he's saying let go of these pretenses and let go of these anxieties. So the part that I've called you to do, you can do effectively. Chapter 7, it's the do chapter, and we won't be able to go through all of it. It's a famous chapter. But starts off by talking about not judging. You probably recall that famous passage. But then in verse 6, it talks about do not give to dogs what is holy and do not throw your pearls before pigs. A lot of ways that's talking about the anxiety that can come by giving your best efforts to people who just aren't interested. Like we talked about before, the gag response. There are some people for which your holiness, your insight, your wisdom, insofar as it's godly wisdom, is going to make them gag because they aren't trying to hear it. The Proverbs talk about it. Rebuke a wise man and he will love you. Rebuke the foolish and they will hate you. Once again, gag response. Not because what you're saying is wrong. They're going to hate you because it's true. And they don't want to embrace the changes that it requires. Because oftentimes in the sins, or in my sins, when life's going well, I'm not really trying to change. And unfortunately, just like it said, Psalm 119, around verses 67, 70, before I was afflicted, I went astray. Those are words of a righteous man, I'm guessing, because he made his way in the Psalms, right? If even the righteous are or find it difficult to make changes in their periods of prosperity, how much more people who don't consider God at all and understand what God is doing in the Sermon on the Mount through Jesus. He's basically telling us to, one, embrace the mindset that's probably very different from what you're being offered in your workplace or your social circles, and understand that you're really blessed when you're meek and humble and you're hungering and thirsting for things that they couldn't care less about. Understand your purpose and understand the things that eat away at your purpose, motives for self-aggrandizement or just the anxieties that beset us all. And once you've gotten those things in check in your mind and your heart, commit yourself, as he's going to end up at the end of chapter 7, to build on the solid foundation, which is Christ, right? And that's a euphemism. What does that mean, building on Christ? It's basically going forward, and after chapter 7, he's going to do a lot of practical teaching. The format, as I've heard it, is he's going to heal a lot of people, and he's going to bring words of wisdom to a lot of people. The physical healings are going to help relieve the consequences, sometimes the consequences of sin that are going to keep people from being able to hear. Why? Because they've gotten themselves in such a tight spot that they just need relief from the pressure of what they're dealing with. Oh, but wait, the people he's really looking for are people who, once they've been relieved from the pain of whether it's physical ailment or simply financial turmoil or whatever the oppression is, who are then willing to listen to a better way of living. And that's in a lot of ways what he's setting up in this Sermon on the Mount. If I give you another opportunity, it's a question we asked before, what kind of people should you be? Now he's asking the question, what are you going to do with it? Why would I help you as opposed to this person over here? I mean, because there's enough for everybody. But in helping you, what am I really doing? Am I just creating another tyrant? Or am I creating a blessing machine? Not necessarily a financial blessing machine, but somebody, when it says in chapter 6, one of those confusing passages I always used to stumble on, the eye is the lamp of the body. So if your eye is healthy, your whole body will be full of light. But if the eye is bad, your whole body will be full of darkness. If then the light in you is darkness, how great is that darkness? I've just found that perplexing until I went back through chapter 5 and I looked at all of those different commands as basically a simple question of what am I either expecting out of this relationship or what am I expecting out of myself in this relationship? And once I started to look at the Sermon on the Mount from that perspective, I started looking at life a little bit more differently in terms of the people who I see God blessing are people who more often than not are looking at relationships from the perspective of what am I expecting out of myself and my relationship with this brother or this sister or these young people, right? As opposed to what can I get out of this relationship? That's a lot of what he's saying when he's talking about check your anger. Because a lot of times when I'm angry at people, it's because they fail to meet my expectations of what they should have done, right? When it's saying don't lust, right? If I'm looking at what's in the best interest of that sister, right? I'm looking for ways to avoid at looking at her in the wrong way, right? Because I'm trying to be concerned about what's best for her. Divorce. If I'm looking at a tough spot as an opportunity, I know I can do better than this, as opposed to how can I make this work out in the best way that it possibly can, then God, I think, is a lot more inclined to give me a second chance or invest in people over time who are looking for opportunities to actually heal those around them, as opposed to those who will simply take their second chance and continue to exploit. So with that, thank you for your patience. I got no great summary on this one. Preached too long again. Last week was the longest sermon I preached since I've been here. Beat you. So with that, my prayer for you is my prayer for me. And we'll take our time and continue looking through Matthew. I'm really impressed with what everybody shared this morning in terms of what they've already seen from Matthew. And you continue to look at it from that perspective, how Jesus is healing people who are able to be healers.